So in this video, I want to respond to a series of comments which were left on a previous upload of mine by the YouTube user Sisyphus Redeemed. Now, I don't think I'll read through the entire conversation at this time, but what I'll do is I'll provide a full text transcript as well as a link to the original upload so that you can peruse this content if you choose to do so, but then so that you don't have to in order to understand what's going on in this video. I will also provide something of a highlights-only synopsis of what had been said at that time. So, in my previous video, I was responding to an argument for abortion for mercy, and most of you have probably already heard this case. Basically, it'll look something like this. You can't just ask yourself whether this child is a person or has a right to life. No, you also have to take into consideration the circumstances into which this baby will be born. Will he suffer from a medical condition? Will she have parents who, because they never wanted her to begin with, will be negligent and abusive? And the idea is that if you say yes to either of these questions, it's alright to terminate the unborn child, not because it's inferior or lacks the status of personhood and all of its concomitant rights, but because it spares the child from living a lifetime of suffering. So this isn't a pro-choice argument. It doesn't address the question of whether or not our penumbral right to privacy or our more fundamental comprehensive right to bodily autonomy is broad enough to encompass the decision whether or not to terminate a pregnancy. It completely circumvents the whole aspect of individual liberties, at least on this front. And instead, it focuses on the question of euthanasia. So this isn't a pro-choice argument. It's not the type of argument you usually encounter when you're talking about abortion. On the contrary, you would expect to see this more in a debate about involuntary euthanization. Now, in the video, my argument was essentially that this idea only stands if we presume that our obligation to provide mercy supersedes our obligation to uphold the child's right to life. The original comment which Sisyphus left on my upload is at this point over 2 years old, and it's not really core to his argument, so I don't want to dedicate too much time and attention to discussing this, but he did kind of strawman what I had to say, so I do want to at least briefly address it, if for no other reason than to clarify on this miscommunication. So, he essentially initiated this dialogue with a sort of snarky, sarcastic jibe about how bold it is of me to characterize the Nazis as compassionate. But I never characterized the Nazis as compassionate. I simply recognized a very well-established historical fact that the values of compassion and mercy were at the core of what allowed the Nazis to do and justify the things that they did throughout the Holocaust. And again, this is fairly well known. It's not really controversial. So, for example, if you look at Robert J. Lifton, a well-established authority on medical killing in Nazi Germany, you will find that in his text, Nazi Doctors, Medical Killing and the Psychology of Genocide, he writes on page 14, and I quote, "The medicalization of killing, the imagery of killing in the name of healing, was at the heart of the Nazi enterprise." And that's page 14. The full text citation is in the information bar if you want to look at it yourself. But even if you can't get your hands on this textbook, you're going to find that there are a number of other sources which can be easily and freely accessed that will verify. Because again, this is something which historians have more or less universally accepted. So for example, if you have a Netflix account, there's a documentary on there from BBC which discusses how the Holocaust progressed from a system of medical killing. So this was a medical theme. That is the rhetoric, this is the mindset, this is the ideological foundation which made the Holocaust possible. So the point in my previous video was that we should learn from history. We should look back and we should see that this is what happened when the Nazis were in charge and it didn't work out. So let's not emulate their failure. Let's realize that this is an extremely dangerous route to take. Furthermore, regardless of whether the route is dangerous, it is inherently ideologically abhorrent, not only because the risks it exposes us to, but because the idea that one individual or some government-appointed surrogate has the right to come in and decide whether or not to kill you, even though you've done nothing wrong, you've committed no crimes, simply because he feels it's merciful, or because the government has provided him with a series of guidelines which claim it's merciful, is inherently inconsistent with the idea that we have an individual right to life, and in this way it's philosophically, ideologically, and politically abhorrent. If you look at the more comprehensive case that Sisyphus presents throughout his comments on this video, what you will find is that it rests upon a central presumption that most of us can probably get behind. And this is the idea that while we do have a right to life, there is an equally legitimate right to mercy which should be respected as well. And I agree with that. There is a right to mercy. But unlike the right to life, the right to mercy is not one with specific mention. It's not something that exists in and of itself. It's a penumbral right. It's a right which emanates from and is inherent within a broader, more comprehensive right. And that's the right to bodily autonomy, otherwise called liberty. The idea here is that you can do what you want with your own body. And I do think that this is broad enough to encompass the consumption of poisons, the slitting of your wrist, or the cutting of your throat. All of these things may be ways in which you seek mercy. So I do believe that you have a right to do so, but I think that that right is a penumbral right. It's something that you can choose to do to yourself because you have a right to make decisions for yourself. You have a right to do what you want to your own body. With all of this being said, I also think that the right to bodily autonomy is broad enough to encompass the right to choose to have sex. Yet somebody cannot do this to you without your consent. And just as having sex with somebody who has a right to copulate without that individual's express consent is rape, so too is euthanizing, terminating, or otherwise killing somebody who has a right to die without that individual's express consent homicide. It is a violation of their right to life, not a realization of their right to mercy, any more than rape is a realization of somebody's right to have sex. Now, another major element in the case that Sisyphus presents is this idea that when our right to life conflicts with our right to mercy, that we have to resolve this situation, and that in order to decide which of the rights we should respect, uphold, and protect, we should rely upon compassion. And at first glance, this seems to be a pretty good idea, but problems start to emerge whenever you ask yourself who gets to make that determination. Who do we let decide how much suffering is how certain to follow before it is acceptable to kill somebody's life, before this becomes mercy and not murder? But that's something I'll discuss in my next video.